Dr. Zufak, I just wanted to wave to you, say good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
Is it Flory?
It is, it's Lori. They told me to not have my video on, but I'm actually gonna turn it on momentarily so I can just say good morning.
Oh, wonderful. It's so good to see you.
You, sir, thank you so much for joining us.
Most welcome.
Your Excellency, President Kagame can. So good to see you, sir. Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'm Flory Lazier, President and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa, CCA, the leading U.S. business association focused solely on Africa and connecting business interests on the continent. I want to personally thank all of you for taking the time to join us today as we kick off the first day of the Leaders Forum. Before I proceed any further, Let me acknowledge the fact that we are all facing trying times. Our thoughts and prayers go out to all those who have lost loved ones during this COVID-19 pandemic. But I am confident that we will get through this together. The Leaders Forum comes at a time when businesses are forced to reevaluate their priorities, stay afloat while nations are experiencing reduction in their GDP and are rethinking how to build resilient and sustainable economies. I am grateful to all the African, US government, and private sector leaders who will be sharing their thoughts, lessons learned, and provide insights on steps they are taking to rebuild their businesses and economies during these challenging times, and the many more who will be Zooming in during these 4 days. I promise that this Leaders Forum will be worth your time. I'm deeply thankful to our sponsors and media partners. I have to let you know who they are: SouthBridge, Afrotourism, Caterpillar, Citi, Covington and Burling, Creative Associates, Development Finance International, Flutterwave, General Electric, Lockheed Martin, Procter & Gamble, Ray-Bin Martin, and Visa. And our media partners are All Africa, APO Group, and Jeune Afrique. Your support of this forum and CCA in these challenging times speaks volumes about your commitment to our 27-year-old organization, our mission to provide access, connections, and insights that advance US-Africa trade and investment and help you to do business on the continent. I'm delighted to welcome you to our forward-looking Leaders Forum entitled Resilient US-Africa Business Engagement to Drive Post-COVID-19 Recovery. Our session today, Resiliency in Action, the Global Financial Response in Africa, will emphasize the call for a coordinated African and global financial response to meet the needs from COVID-19 and economic recovery in Africa, and the role of actors like multilateral institutions and the private sector. We look forward to a rich and insightful conversation among leaders who are playing a critical role in addressing these issues. I am also really delighted that His Excellency Paul Kagame, President of the Republic of Rwanda, has agreed to offer opening remarks for this session. Mr. President, we are honored to have you with us today. I would also like to acknowledge and thank Diane Wilkins, Founding President and CEO of Development Finance International and a Vice Chair of CCA's Board of Directors, who will moderate a fireside chat with the President. So Diane, over to you.
Thank you and good morning, everyone. President Kagame, it's my great privilege to introduce you as President of the Republic of Rwanda to the CCA's 2020 Leaders Forum. President Kagame has been leading the institutional reform of the African Union since 2016, and in 2018 served a one-year term as its chairperson. He's currently chairperson of the African Union's Development Agency, AUDA-NEPAD, as well as African Union leader for domestic health financing. In 2019, President Kagame was elected chairperson of the East African Community. The hallmarks of His Excellency's administration are peace and reconciliation, women's empowerment, promotion of investment and entrepreneurship, and access to information technology, a cause he also champions as co-chair of the Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development. Your Excellency, as Vice Chair of the CCA Board of Directors, thank you for honoring us by opening CCA's 2020 Leaders Forum. We look forward to your remarks and the fireside chat that follows to hear your thoughts on building and sustaining a resilient US-Africa business engagement to drive the post-COVID-19 recovery, the theme of our forum. Mr. President, it's now my distinct pleasure to invite you to open the 2020 Leaders Forum. Mr. President, I need to interrupt to say that your microphone is not on. We hate to miss a word. We can see you clearly. Allow me to invite Carla, who's managing the technology for CCA. Carla, do you have some advice? I think we are in a moment of pause while we work out the technical issue of the moment. Carla, I'm also advised from several chats coming through, we need to adjust the video as well. Flori, I see you're also muted. Did you want to make some remarks in the moment?
Is it okay now?
Thank you.
Yes, yes.
Very good,
can-
Mr.
fine.
We
President.
can hear you, sir. Okay, and it appears that people can see you as well now.
Thank you.
Okay, everything's
Yay, thank you so much.
all right.
Please go ahead, Your Excellency, and please start from the beginning.
Thank-
We don't want to miss anything you have to say.
CEO Flori Lisa, Vice Chair Diane Wilkins, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to be with you today. Flori, I want to thank you and your team for the invitation to join your members at this critical time. The Corporate Council on Africa has been a good partner and friend to Rwanda and to Africa as a whole for more than 25 years. The world is full of uncertainties right now, but there is no doubt that Africa and the United States will continue to be important trade and investment partners for each other. Before we start our interactive session, allow me to highlight 3 areas of common interest. The first is combating the pandemic. Yesterday marked the 100th day since the first coronavirus case was detected in Rwanda. We have fortunately managed to keep the pandemic under control so far through a combination of lockdown policies and rigorous testing and tracing. However, procuring adequate supplies of testing materials and protective equipment has been a real challenge for every African country. Last week, the African Union launched an African medical supplies platform to pool the procurement of essential health items. This is a partnership with Africa's private sector, led by Strive, Masiwa, at the African Union's invitation. We welcome participation by the American private sector in this effort. The second area is the urgent need for coordinated action to ensure adequate fiscal space for Africa. This is essential both for the health response and also to preserve jobs and livelihoods. The United States supported the G20 initiative to suspend debt service on public debt. This was an important first step, but as the crisis drags on, more will need to be done. The African Union has appointed 6 special envoys to represent our continent in these negotiations. Once again, the backing of the United States for timely and innovative measures will be vital. The third common interest is trade, specifically the launch of the African Continental Free Trade Area. The United States has been a strong supporter of development through trade, such as with the AGOA program, as Flori knows well. As these internal trade obstacles within Africa continue to fall, we look forward to strong engagement from American companies and investors working together with African firms. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to our discussion.
Mr. President, thank you very much for bringing forward such a clear focus, addressing Rwanda's resiliency and that of the continent, but also raising and heightening the ongoing challenges and the opportunities in front of us all. I'm delighted now to join you for a fireside chat absent the fireside.
Welcome.
Thank you. May I begin by asking, what lessons are you learning from Rwanda's response to COVID-19? And what policies have you been inspired or are you developing to strengthen resiliency in the economy now and the health sector for the future?
Well, in actual fact, it is true. I think everybody is learning lessons or confirming some of those things we have learned over the years, that they will work for people, for the economy, for many things that allow progress to be made by countries and societies. The first thing, it's really focusing on the very people who are widely affected, and also by that bringing them into the understanding of what is going on, and also enabling them to contribute to the very solutions required to deal with such a problems as this pandemic is. In the area, for example, when we're talking about health, and since this pandemic relates even more closely to health matters, public health is very central, as we can now confirm and have known before, much as we didn't probably in different parts of the world concentrate on that, so that we build the structures and the capacities that are required to allow public health to be solid, so that many other things can be built on that. And even with the economic aspects of the situation, as is well known, the whole world, the economy of every country has been hit very hard. So all along, as we plan and put in place different policies to allow our economies to develop, there is need for this mindset that we should be investing and in and doing things that will allow our economies to survive different downturns and different laws that are created by things that develop on their own without anybody's invitation.
May I ask you in follow-up to that helpful answer, Your leadership on the Continental Free Trade area begins to set a path forward to eliminate cross-country boundaries and borders. And how do you see this pandemic and future challenges benefiting from that free trade agreement? I noted you mentioned the web-enabled procurement that you've stood up for health goods. So I'm interested in how this free trade area could benefit, in fact, the recovery.
It's very interesting because the recovery from what has happened, whether it is from the public health challenges every country has faced, be it the free trade area, the common thread here is people working together. It's integration. When we work together and allow integration to spread and become strong across our continent, we will be able to deal with even the public health challenges that have affected us and have affected trade and business and everything that we know of. So working together, cooperation is essential. There's no question about it. So now the free trade area, therefore, in a sense, benefits more from the understanding that we really cannot avoid working together if we want to thrive, if we want to develop, if we want to move. It's not just business in a sort of isolation. No, it's business to work across for everybody. Therefore, it's health to work, public health to work across boundaries. Therefore, free trade area, I think, will benefit from the lessons we have learned. And already we see that people increasingly, even if they understood it before, I think there is a sense of urgency that we need really to embrace both free trade area and working together, and therefore dealing with other challenges that give rise to many other problems.
Thank you, very well emphasized. As you look forward, even in 2021 and beyond, what do you think will be different in Rwanda as we move through this pandemic? And what do you expect the main drivers of the recovery for Rwanda to be and the implications for business? And I would say both intra-Africa business and also the relationships with our US members of the Corporate Council.
Well, to begin with, as I said earlier, it's been a very tough situation. And I think when people work to deal with the tough situations, they become strong at the end of the day once they've turned the corner. And I think that's what we're looking for. But our economy before this pandemic was stable, was already doing well, and we are seeing really growth, medium, even long term, almost assured. So there are some of those activities we were engaged in and investments made in the area of infrastructure, in the technology, in the services sector was booming, and the hospitality side of that, transport, logistics, manufacturing, and so all these were really doing well. But of course, many of them have been, if not all, have been affected by these challenges because all these sectors were making good progress because of the interaction, not only within our country, but also the interaction with the rest of the world, which has also been affected. So having gone through this period and have stabilized the situation and managed the pandemic with some good progress to talk about, much as we still see it is still with us, and we are seeing increase in cases of people, fortunately stabilized, not deaths. We have had for all this time only 2 people killed, dying out of this. And there are many recoveries. Almost those who are affected now are equal to those who have recovered. So one can have a sort of mirror image of that with that situation you've just raised, let's say, of business. There are businesses that have been hit hard, if not all of them. So with the space that has been created in terms of stabilizing this situation of the pandemic, we can kickstart progress or development or recovery of some of the areas of our economy that have been hit. We are seeing, we've opened up to domestic tourism, for example, and we have made a clear arrangement even for the high-end tourism for people from the outside world who were already used to coming. We are making arrangements because of the stable situation. We are seeing interest of people coming back. It's gradual. So we are trying to encourage that, to make sure that everyone who will make the decision to come to us should feel that they will be safe. When they are here, as usual, as what we have always invested in is that whoever is dealing with us knows what to expect. There is predictability, and we make sure that we reassure people of their safety once they are here and when they go back. So these are the sectors we are now focused on where we can make some recovery. We've invested in that. In fact, our country has put aside an economic recovery fund. So far, it's $100 million we have put aside, but we are planning to increase it to anything between that and $200 million, so that we support businesses, we support these other sectors that need some injection and have been hit. And then we have benefited from the partners who have given us support. The IMF, the World Bank has also availed funds generally, but specifically for Africa as well, and in which we are able to tap and also benefit from that. So really getting better coordinated, better planning, being able to foresee what might lie ahead, and then mobilizing our people to understand that this is a crisis situation, and they all understand, and everyone is here understanding and patient and ready to give it whatever it requires from them.
Thank you. And in a follow-up on that response, as well as your earlier comment, you mentioned that the AU had appointed 6 envoys to represent the continent. And while you're getting support today from the IMF and a second disbursement recently, and of course from the World Bank and the other partners, what more are you looking for? And what is your hope for these 6 envoys? And how and when should we follow their success?
To begin with, it was a good idea, and under the chairman of the African Union, President Ramaphosa of South Africa, working with the rest of us, we started by, and rightly so, encouraging that Africa works together as an entity, as a continent, instead of fragmented pieces of it in terms of countries. And this has many benefits. working together definitely benefits everyone. We manage the situation that affects all of us together. For example, in terms of procurement of the personal protective equipment or test kits, or in the future, or hopefully near future, when the vaccines or medicines are found for this, you cannot understand the nightmare an individual country would face to go on the world market and trying to source, for this and for that, and on their own. Some of them would take maybe 5 years without getting anything they wanted, or very small portion of what they wanted. But when we pool resources, first of all, in fact, we are already working through the African Union Commission with the CDC, the Centers for the Disease Control of our continent, and then with the Strive Masio, as I said, and many others. And in fact, we have started by contributing ourselves, countries. Rwanda made its contribution, Kenya, South Africa, different countries have made contributions to this fund that is at the CDC and with the African Union Commission. And on that, we can put in many other resources from different partners and friends who want to contribute. But at the same time, make pool procurements for different things, looking at the continent rather than looking at one country or telling each country to go their own way and find what they want. So that is very, very helpful. And the 6 envoys also go beyond that. They've been interacting with the different partners, the multilaterals, even with the relationship in the bilateral area, or out there in the commercial entities that, so interacting with those that can help us and really making sense of this scale and the unity that comes with it, so that anything that comes our way has a possibility of making higher impact than rather in a scattered form. So the envoys are people with expertise in different areas, and most of those are the areas that would benefit Africa to deal with this pandemic, and also dealing with the partners who want to bring in the kind of support we need. So we are seeing already good progress being made. And then other institutions of our continent, the African Development Bank or Africa Exim Bank, all these are very active in mobilizing resources and directly working through the continental structures to benefit every country and to deal with this pandemic.
Well, the African Union and you and your colleagues are to be commended for approaching this Africa as one and going about this without so much fragmentation. Quite on a different scale, we experience some of it in the States, so we have great empathy, compassion for what Africa and it must be going through, as well as congratulations for taking this approach.
Much appreciated.
Yes. President Kagame, we've come to the end of our fireside chat. May I personally thank you for the opportunity to be with you and for your focused remarks. Please call on CCA, call on CCA, call on our members, and of course the wider network anytime. And Flori, I know you would also like to thank President Kagame. Thank you, sir.
Oh, I certainly would. Mr. President, thank you so much for joining us today, kicking off our Leaders Forum, for being so generous with your time and for your insightful remarks. CCA is here for Rwanda and for Africa, and we look forward to following up with you and the other leaders on the continent and those in some of the institutions you talked about, to support you not only in COVID, but in making sure that there's a resilient and powerful recovery post-COVID. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Flori.
So now we will transition to our high-level panel discussion. I just want to mention before I introduce our moderator that some of the key people that he talked about and key institutions that His Excellency President Kagame spoke about are here. We have at least one of the envoys here, and so we're really honored. Let me introduce, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this session, Kalidou Gadio. He's a partner and lead for Africa and the Middle East and North Africa practice at Manat, Phelps, and Phillips. That is a CCA member.
It's just the next panelist, Kaberuka and Vera.
Maybe I can follow a bit and then we'll leave later.
Anyway, before I turn it over to Kalidou, I want to go over some housekeeping rules for our question and answer period. We hope we'll have time for questions from the audience today. We have such a huge crowd, and we know we'll have lots of questions, but we have such tremendous people on our panel. Again, if you're going to submit a question, please do so through the Zoom chat function. And then we'll take questions from those who have provided their names so Kalidou, over to you. Hopefully have a few technical things going on here, but hopefully we can move forward with now what I know will be a really interesting discussion. Kalidou.
Thank you, Flori. I'm so happy, and first of all, let me thank you for I think I have some problem.
I do. You need to adjust your screen.
Am I on?
No, if you move your screen so that you can see your face. That's better.
Well, thank you again. Thank you, Flori. I think this is a fantastic opportunity and really an event, given what has happened over the past 3 or 4 months. This issue of resilience of African economy is certainly something that we all would like to discuss about. Luckily, we have really a fantastic panel. Let me just say something. Listening after His Excellency, I can see that a number of African countries have taken a number of initiatives, but we will be trying to talk a little bit about the debt and certain number of policies surrounding actually this crisis. And just for your information, the data is not actually very clear, but there is a sense that the total debt today in Africa is about $350 to $400 billion. It represents on average 53% of the GDP. It is divided roughly, one third, one third, one third. One third multilateral, one third private, one third bilateral. In the bilateral, there is a lion's share of China, which is about 24%, and the remaining 10%. But we have actually the expert here to talk about it. I don't know if Dr. Kaberuka is online, because I would like to start with him, given the fact that His Excellency mentioned earlier that he's one of the envoys. Mr. Kaberuka, are you online? If Mr. Kaberuka is not online, I will certainly just jump to Vera Songwe. Vera, as you know, is Undersecretary General for United Nations and Executive Secretary for the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Vera, could you tell us, in a sense, what is it exactly you have been doing during the past 4 months about this crisis, and what initiative you think ECA has taken, and just let's start it from there.
Thank you, Khalidou, Your Excellency, President Paul Kagame. Thank you, Flori, for inviting us to this very important and interesting conversation. I think Donald is online because he was there before, so maybe we just try him again for a few minutes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can start.
And while waiting, 3 things. You know, when the pandemic started, when we had the COVID virus, I think the first thing we all thought about was Africa was going to get hit from the health perspective. So the first thing that the ECA did was we did a report looking at what was the potential impact of the COVID-19 or the coronavirus at the time on the continent. To our great, I guess, dismay, what we realized was that the health crisis was going to come with a lag, but the economic crisis was going to come much faster. So by the middle of March, we realized that a lot of our economies were already suffering from the impact of the crisis because, of course, in our principal markets, Europe and Asia, they were already locked down. So flights into and out of the Middle East, into and out of Europe, into and out of Asia had all closed down. A lot of Africa's GDP today, 51% of Africa's GDP is services. A lot of that is tourism. And so what we immediately saw was a closing of our markets, a closing of our economies, logistics, interruptions of supply chains. So based on these reports that we did, we had a meeting with the ministers of finance. And it was even more spectacular because the ministers of finance, of course, are watching this day to day. And so they could see revenue to GDP dropping. Remember that revenue to GDP on the continent, tax revenue to GDP on the continent. And we as ECA are fortunate because when we talk about the continent, we talk about all of Africa. It's somewhere in the area of about 13.4% on average. Countries, of course, like Rwanda are much higher. South Africa is at 25% tax revenue to GDP, and that is our best country. We know that in East Asia, you know, you need 45% tax to GDP or 34%. So the first thing that we did was say, if African countries are not getting in any revenues and they need to respond to a health crisis, we need to find some way of giving them immediate liquidity. Hence the call for a debt standstill, which was basically a 2-year debt service suspension for all African countries. The idea then was to say, if we can translate those resources into resources that countries could use immediately to begin to address the crisis, that will give us some time. Remember, again, we have 1.8 beds per hospital on the continent compared to everybody else. So there was a health crisis we needed to respond to and prepare for, but there was also an economic crisis. So the first thing the ECA did was to say, how can we give more resources to countries? How can we ensure that we put additional resources and then begin to identify those who need it most? So I think those were the first 2 things, was call the finance ministers together exactly as President Kagame had said. Collectively, the force of collective action is much more powerful. We are lucky that after those meetings, the World Bank and the IMF came forward and have now begun to respond to the call of the finance ministers, first by the G20 debt service suspension, but also by the IMF giving some debt relief to some of our poorest countries as we move forward. We continue to work and to see how we can do more for the continent. We need more. I think every day the IMF revises the growth estimates downwards, unfortunately, but we hope that with the continent collectively, and I think as President Kagame said, with the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, domestic internal African consumption hopefully will be strong enough to be able to help us begin to build back better.
Thank you, Vera. As you mentioned, my recollection is that indeed G20 had mandated World Bank and the IMF to take up the matter with the rest of Africa. Fortunately, we have Dr. Albert Zofak here. Mr. Zofak, could you tell us in a nutshell what has the World Bank has been doing to address issues that have been mentioned, and what is your take on the issue that is being raised?
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, President Paul Kagame, Flori, and the team at CCA. Thank you so much for inviting us to this wonderful panel. At World Bank and precisely in the Africa region of the group, what we've been doing is to basically work on three important pillars. One is helping countries face the health crisis by putting together projects to protect lives. The second is attending and working with countries to protect livelihoods, households, and firms. And the third pillar is protecting the future. But let me step back a little bit and say we are actually living unprecedented times. In this year, 2020, Africa is going to get into a recession for the first time in 25 years. When we published our report, the Africa's Pulse, in April, we clearly pointed to the fact that this was not only going to be a health crisis, an economic crisis, but a potential food crisis as import of food have collapsed. And Africa does import between $30 to $40 billion of food per year. And agricultural output was expected to decline because of this huge COVID impact. So countries have to really put together a comprehensive strategy, not only to cater to the emergency, but also to start sowing the seed for sustainability, for recovery moving forward. So the World Bank has actually stepped in with the IMF and work with other international institutions, as Vera mentioned, to implement the debt standstill. And that initiative alone is leading to countries saving close to $12 billion that are immediate fiscal space to fight the crisis. But in addition, what we have been doing is to make sure African countries get direct budget support. And this year alone, the Africa region has delivered more than $20 billion to African countries in terms of budget support to fight the pandemic. But we're also ensuring that we push the domestic reforms that would create more transparency, better efficiency in managing our public expenditure, and create more space within countries to really fight this unprecedented crisis.
Well, Albert, there have been some critics that most of what the World Bank has done is more reshuffle the resources. What is it exactly the additionality, like new money? Obviously, sometimes institutions like yours, when they face a crisis, they can repackage existing, portfolio and to move, loan from what sector to another. Could you tell me what is it exactly fresh new money additionality? I understand that you have provided numerous, quite substantial resources, but what part of it is really fresh money versus basically existing loans that were not performing, that have been repackaged in some way or fashion?
That's an excellent, very, very interesting question. What we have done at the World Bank is to make sure that we shift inefficient programs into COVID response. That's absolutely right. And we have certainly helped countries to avail those resources to immediately fight the COVID. The second, what is even more important is that we are now pushing new resources into areas that we believe are more structural and that would help countries actually exiting this crisis faster. For example, in the digital area, we have now pushed for more implementation of projects, new projects in the digital sphere. We are pushing for additional financing and additional resources into the social protection areas where most African population, African people were not actually covered. So there is clear additionality when it comes to, for example, saving lives, saving or protecting livelihood, when it comes to our expanded portfolio in social protection, in the digital, and in women empowerment, for example.
Thank you. I will come back to you because I really would like to push to know really how much actually additional money versus, as you said, reshuffling resources from one area to another. If I understand, Dr. Kaberuka is back online. If that is the case, I would like to ask him a couple of questions before I move on. Dr. Kaberuka? I heard from Carla that Dr. Kaberuka is back online. Otherwise, I would like to move into the financial public sector institution to address my good friend Admesus. Admesus, are you online?
Yes, Khalidou, I hope you can hear me. I am online.
Yes, I hear you very well. Admesus, you are clearly not a multilateral, but in a way you are a regional financial institution, but a very, very performing one. And you have something which is really specific in the sense that you provide assistance to both public and private sector. You are both an investment bank, a development bank, and including a trade financing institution. So what is your take on really what has happened over the last 4 months in the wake of the COVID-19? What specific action TDB has been taking? And can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, thank you, Khalidou, and greetings, Excellency, and my distinguished fellow panelists. Well, Khalidou, I think the first thing that happened is we came to grips with the fact that a huge shock had come into our region. Of course, it's a global shock. And the first thing we did is we said, well, resilience begins with ensuring that you yourself as an institution can stay in business, can stay open and can engage and can do so safely. And so we very quickly reorganized ourselves internally to ensure that we can stay open and reach out and do the things that our various clients, current and new, would expect of us. Some of my colleagues have made reference to the debt standstill. Of course, what has happened is there's been a huge liquidity shock because revenues have, of course, frozen. So we adopted forbearance measures alongside many other financial institutions that had a sense of responsibility. We of course had to give some breathing room to various existing clients. And then we pulled up our sleeves and we asked ourselves a question: how can we step up and help as institutions, whether they're government institutions or private sector companies that needed a little bit of outreach? So just to give an example, there was one hospital project that had a sponsor involved with a contractor. And of course, there were some, how can I say, interruptions of liquidity, and they needed the project to continue. So what we did is we applied trade finance techniques, forfeiting specifically, to take over the obligations of a local bank, provide the liquidity so that the contractor could continue building the hospital, and shifting the burden of payment down the line for the local bank. That's just one example of how we've taken the partnership approach to smaller financial institutions in our member states that needed us to step in. Of course, we've also undertaken some special grant programs to, of course, do our part to chip in on a grant basis. I think His Excellency made reference to the African Union Center for Disease Control. We've made a grant contribution to them and to many different local entities in our various countries to provide PPEs, but also importantly to help strengthen local infrastructure around water provision. So borehole technology, of course, is well established. So we helped a number of local communities strengthen their access to safe water so that they could do the washing and all of the things that becomes very intensive in this kind of environment. But just the key thing really to highlight is partnerships, Khalidou, because I think for many African financial institutions, what became very important is working together. I think His Excellency talked about the collaborative approach taking place at the political level. Well, at the financial industry level, the same thing has happened. And we have joined forces with a number of partners, both DFIs, but also commercial banks, to step up our efforts together. And the key thing we've done is we've tried to make sure we stayed open for business and continued providing critical inputs to the food sector in terms of agricultural production, for instance, fertilizer. There's also other inputs that have been required. And what we've done is we've brought in partners to share the risk, taking joint approaches in underwriting specific programs to keep the lights on and to keep industry going. So I think that's really been the partnership angle of things, and I think in this regard we've formed new partnerships that we were already working on, but we managed to push very quickly to get them off the ground. Digitization, huge, another way of making sure we can stay afloat in a lockdown environment. We've found ourselves pushing innovations like we never have before. So now we find ourselves cutting the lead time in doing a trade finance transaction in 2 weeks or less because we're using blockchain technologies that doesn't require paper. You can't rely on DHL to transport paper across borders. So again, this is the innovation that has really come on track very quickly, and we've proven the concept, and it's been a very welcome opportunity in that regard.
Thank you, Administrator. Luckily, we have Dr. Kaberuka back online. Mr. Kaberuka, before you came in, we listened to His Excellency, Ms. Paul Kagame. He mentioned a number of initiatives that Rwanda has been taking. And one of the things that he mentioned was indeed at the African level, there is some level of coordination at the initiative of the African Union. And you, among other people, have been appointed as envoy to address the issue falling from actually this COVID-19. Could you describe to us your mandate and what you have been able to achieve so far?
Thank you, Khalid. And sorry about this technical issues. I think the president has said it all, and the previous speakers have articulated the problem very well. So let me just say a few things. I think it is important to understand the nature of the problem we're dealing with. This is not a problem due to bad policy. This is a unique crisis, unique in the last 100 years. We had the Great Depression, we had the global financial crisis, and the toolbox was fairly known. But this is a crisis for which the toolbox is not known. And the second, this is the first time we have a crisis which affects all parts of the world. The North, the South, the rich, the poor countries. The public health systems of rich countries are as tested now. They're under stress almost as those of poor countries. It's fairly unique. And therefore, our mandate, which the president said was to avoid a scattered solution, is to have a coordinated response. A coordinated global response at the pandemic level, at the economic level, and at minimizing the damage. It is important I say this because Africa is not going to the world looking for something. We're looking to do things together. In the same way as the rich countries in the G20 have pulled out a stimulus of $6 trillion, the question is basically how to ensure that Africa is part of this global coordinated solution. Because this is a fight for which it has to succeed everywhere. In the past crisis, it was the North helping the South. It was the rich countries helping the poor. But this time round, we're all in together. So our first mandate is, can we have a coordinated solution at the pandemic level, economic and social response? The second is to do so with speed. Because typically, once the acute phase of the problem is over, attention turns on to domestic policy issues. So we need to do it with speed, turn promises into cash. Thirdly, we want to do it with flexibility. And here I really want to salute the actions of the International Monetary Fund. I think the leadership of the IMF has understood that this crisis is truly unique, and they've gone out to innovate, to look for flexible solutions. The third thing was to ensure there is additionality. you did ask the question, I think, to one of our colleagues. Are we rearranging funding? Are we simply front-loading future funding? In part, yes. And therefore, we'll have to work with the organizations who are front-loading resources to ensure that they can top up those resources in the future. And lastly, it's about inclusiveness. Our president insisted very much that our response has to be inclusive. We can't like Zimbabwe, like Eritrea, like Sudan, and those who would have challenges. And they are hoping this is done. And very finally, Khalid, it's important to explain what this debt moratorium is and what it is not. The moratorium is not because Africa is suffering a debt crisis. Many of the countries have debt to GDP below 60%. We have a few countries who are moving to debt distress. That is true. We have a few who had pre-existing vulnerabilities, which have been compounded by COVID. But the majority were doing quite well, 6% growth, 7%. And so what is at issue here is fiscal space. How to provide room for countries to spend a bit more on health, okay? Which was being crowded out by debt service in some countries. And very finally, the last point I'll make to you is that in looking for making sure that Africa can be part of the global solution, we are really working very hard as envoys on this issue of the special drawing rights, because this is where the solution could come from. Now, there are whole technical, political issues around it, which we're working on with partners, and are hoping that if this succeeds, we could generate quite significant amounts of resources, which can be spent on the health systems, but also on income support, on income replacement, on ensuring that we minimize the damage caused by the pandemic on our economic systems.
Thank you, Dr. Kaberuka. I think this is actually very, very good information in terms of what you have been doing. And I will come back to you to give us a little bit more your perspective on what you think you have achieved. But before then, and I would like to go to our only representative of the private sector, Akin Daoudou. Obviously, I don't know if you can speak for all the private sector, because you're only Citibank, even though the most one of the most important players in Africa. Could you tell us briefly what Citibank has been doing, both to its private as well as public client, in order to address this pandemic and its consequences?
Oh, sorry. I didn't unmute myself. Can you hear me okay, Khalidou?
Yes, hello? I do. Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon to everyone, Your Excellency, President Kagame, and my fellow panelists. Well, you know, it's been interesting for us, as many of the previous speakers have said, this is an unprecedented crisis that nobody saw coming. We have a continuity of business plans and arrangements, but nobody quite envisaged that this would be the circumstances under which they would be activated. And we had to adapt a lot off the cuff and improvise in terms of even being open for business ourselves to be able to continue to serve our clients. We're in over 30 markets in sub-Saharan Africa, full commercial bank in 12 of those markets, and non-presence activities in another 21 markets. So our customer base is somewhat diverse, and the needs and requirements of our clientele has been, you know, divergent and different. So we've had to adapt to various circumstances across sub-Saharan Africa in particular, which is the cluster that I cover. But a few things come to mind in terms of common themes. Governments are focused on creating the fiscal space they need, our public sector clients, focused on creating the fiscal space they need to address the immediate health concern. And as Dr. Kaberuka mentioned earlier, spending on social infrastructure like healthcare had been crowded out by debt service, amongst other things. So people have been focused on the public sector side on creating that fiscal space. Financial institutions are focused on protecting their balance sheet. A lot of our clients are financial institutions. In many ways, we play an intermediary role in Africa as banking the banks in terms of correspondent relationships and access to trade finance for various financial institutions. And a lot of our clients in that space have been focused on protecting their balance sheet, maintaining their capital adequacy, and maintaining their access to liquidity in general. Specifically foreign currency especially, which tends to tighten up at times of crisis like this, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And corporates, we have our corporates as well, and they've been worried about their markets for the FMCG and FMCG companies, the drop in demand, the challenges that poses for them, the fate of their suppliers and their value chain partners, the sanctity of the value chain, their trade, and their ability to keep things moving and to have some demand at the end of the day on the other side, and the cash flow squeeze that would entail for many of them. So we found many of our corporate clients looking for working capital financing and short-term needs to fund the gaps that opened up because of the seizures in the flow of the value chain because of the exceptional circumstances we find ourselves in. So that's what our clients have been working on, and that's what we've been working with them on, to work with them, make the facilities available, keeping our trade lines open, and partnering with other institutions as well to continue to provide capacity for many of our clients. So we work with many of the multilateral institutions, including TDB, and even people like the IFC, to provide trade line guarantees to avail more trade loan credit to many of our FI institutions to keep the oils of trade and the value chain working. We've been able to do that. We worked with the AFDB to arrange, we helped them arrange a $3 billion social bond to fight the COVID-19 earlier on in the pandemic. And we have long provided virtual tools for our clients, electronic banking platforms that allow them to continue to operate even when remote from the office, to run their transactions, to continue to manage their affairs in a secure manner in terms of access rights and accreditation, just to continue to operate. Our own operational resilience was important, but we also helped our own clients with their operational resilience via the virtual tools and the electronic banking tools we put in place. And we've seen more and more corporates embrace e-banking and e-commerce. We always had some conversion, but there was some reluctance historically. We've seen a lot more converts over the past 2 or 3 months, as this has become almost the only way in which people can operate safely. And so we've seen some of our online volumes double in certain countries, maybe even go up by 200% in other countries, just because of the realities that this unique crisis has brought and has forced people to think differently. So it's been a variety of things, like I mentioned, working with partners to bring solutions to our clients, using our existing facilities and newly structured facilities to meet our clients' needs, and using technology to bridge the gap and to pierce the gloom and to sort of reduce the distance between the clients and us, and between the clients and their suppliers and their value chain, and ultimately the market.
Thank you, Akin. I understand you a conflicting agenda, you may have to leave. That's why I want to follow up a question. Obviously, one of the issues that are being debated is how to treat, the current, the servicing of the debt that is owed, and whether some form of suspension, moratorium is in place. There are some issues that are raised. I mean, is it sort of double-edged sword? Should countries trying to benefit from it? To what extent? And what might be the consequences for countries that actually benefit from such a kind of moratorium? And overall, could you describe to the audience what, if any, mechanism can be in fact implemented or followed by African countries who seek in fact to obtain this kind of a moratorium?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very, very, very good question. It's a very challenging one. I mean, there are no easy answers. I think the reality is 20 years ago, or when we had the HIPC program for highly impoverished countries and the debt forgiveness, Africa came into that as a basically begging with a handout, with no access to market and with significant constraints in terms of its debt burden and its economic situation. This time the situation is a bit different and it's more nuanced as a result. So the solutions are not as clear-cut. A lot of countries have access to markets, to the international markets, and they are reluctant to lose that access to the markets. And that is why things like the debt moratorium and debt forgiveness get tricky, because it's important to keep your access to markets, even while you are getting the relief that you need. And which is more important, you can get relief today, it increases your borrowing costs in the future, which was a concern given the talk of rating agency downgrades and the moral hazard you see when you find that the resources are not equal, right? You think about inequality. People think about inequality within countries, but inequality between countries is also important. So in the developed world, there's a lot of forbearance and forgiveness for the corporate sector, for banks, for companies. You see it in the US, you see it in Europe. But because a lot of Africa's debt burden is foreign currency dominated, we are not able to benefit quite as easily. And if we do benefit, it makes the creditors feel that African rates are risky. So and then that becomes an issue in the future. So it's a very tough balance to strike. For people without access to market, for countries without access to market, it is easier to accept the moratoria and the forgiveness of the debt deferment, though everybody wants access to market. So even those guys are thinking about their future, the future as well. And for the people with access to market, it's a real concern. We've seen the DSSI, which Côte d'Ivoire and Senegal took last week. And I think that solves some of the problems, because to the extent that both countries are were able to get clearance from the rating agencies in terms of it not leading to a downgrade. And even Moody's, who were the slight outlier there, did say it would mean the countries will go on review, but then half the countries in the world are on review. So I don't suppose that made them particularly unique. So that was one solution that I think works up to a point. But Africa, it's a sign of the fact that Africa has made some progress, that debt forgiveness is not a no-brainer anymore for many of the African countries because of the access to market they have and because of the diversification in their funding sources, no longer just the reliance on multilateral debt, but other options as well. So it's difficult to find a solution that will get that relief without having some repercussions in the future in terms of access to market and funding costs. DSSI helps, but it's not really sufficient. Having said that, we've seen the Eurobond yields for most of the issuers in SSA drop off again after reaching a peak in mid-March. Nigeria, Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, we've seen the yields go back to the pre-crisis levels, which indicates that the private sectors are also now understand that Africa should be okay and should come out of this in reasonable shape, as they went into it in reasonable shape. And that again vindicates the decision perhaps not to accept all the moratoria up front, but to keep an eye out on the market in the future and access to it. It's a tough one. Few solutions, but no easy answers.
Yes, Akin, before you go again, let me just follow up a question just in case you can't, Sania. What is it you're saying exactly?
I would like to come in there eventually, Khalidou, because I think there's 410 people.
And I would like to react as well
get
to
some
that.
good clarifications. On the DSSI, given I think we can take some credit at the Economic Commission for Africa for asking for the debt service standstill. Let's just be clear, and this is very important because we're talking actually about the sort of solvability and liquidity of countries. Africa today, as you rightly said, Akin, is very diverse and very different. We do have African countries that are now middle income. A lot more African countries are middle income and have access to markets than they did when we did the highly indebted poor country initiative, the HIPC. And so that essentially changes a little bit the perception that you take to Africa when you have a conversation with Africa. However, we still do have some countries, again, as Akin said, that do not have quote unquote, and when we talk about access to markets, there are two kinds of access to markets. There's the Eurobonds, and then there is the commercial bank lending. We have about 21 countries that have access to the Eurobonds. We have about 42 countries that have access to commercial banks. And that's important, and I'll come back to that point in a minute. However, as Dr. Kaberuka said, the minute you ask for a debt service suspension, and remember, we did not ask for a cancellation of debt. With the ministers, we said, let's go for a debt service suspension because you need immediate liquidity into the system. Now your question was, is there a problem or isn't there a problem in doing the debt service suspension? And the answer is no. And I'll explain to you very clearly why. In the first group of countries, the countries that do not have access to Euro bonds, and actually do not have a lot of access to commercial banks either, and are not what the World Bank and the international community call middle income countries. So they're essentially the low income, poorest countries of the world. Getting a debt suspension or accessing the debt service suspension initiative is a no-brainer. Yes, you should do it. So any country that falls in that category, and I'm glad Akin is nodding as well, should just do it immediately. Now, there was one issue there. The issue was they had some countries, some of these countries have access to commercial bank lending. And we did have in the commercial bank agreements a cross-default waiver that said, if you take bilateral debt service suspensions, you may be considered in default. We at the ECA, with the envoys, are now working with the Institute of International Finance to get a broad waiver for that. So that will take care of that problem. And so essentially all those countries, 21 of them should take the DSSI. And why is this? If you take a country, altogether the DSSI is about $13 billion. We need health services, we need water, we need safety nets. This is resources that immediately allow you to have access to that. There is a second category of countries, and this is, I think, the countries that Akin is talking about, that essentially do have access to Euro sovereign bonds and may or may not be able to take the DSSI. And so what is the issue there? The issue is if you do the DSSI, the bilateral, remember, it is the G20 bilateral, which means only country to country. This is not about markets. The debt service suspension bilateral is country to country acceptance, including China. China has $8.2 billion that Africa needs to pay this year. So if you do the debt service suspension initiative, Africa gets $8.2 billion in liquidity immediately that they can put back into their systems. Now, some of these countries have an IMF program where within the IMF program, there has been an agreement with the IMF that you can go to the market. Kenya, for example, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, have access to markets within their IMF accepted programs. So essentially, if you do the DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, you can still go to market. So it does not preclude you from the market. And I think it's a very important point because many people get confused with the fact that if you do the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, you cannot go to markets. That's not true. The third issue, which is a little bit of a confusion, is that if you do the Public Debt Service Suspension Initiative, you will not be able to go to markets because you get downgraded. And I think, again, Akin has been very clear with that. Standard & Poor's and Fitch have all written papers, position papers saying, if you take the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the Public Debt Service Suspension Initiative, we will not downgrade you. Moody's has said, if you take the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, we will put you on review, meaning we believe that you're taking the debt service suspension initiative is a sign of stress, even though it does not imply stress. So we will put you on review for 3 months and see whether indeed you get into a stressful condition, and then we will actually decide whether we want to downgrade you or not. And in the case of Moody's, for example, they have taken rating actions on South Africa and on Nigeria before the DS. Actually, South Africa does not qualify for the DSSI. The final component of the DSS, of the debt service suspension initiative, as called for by the Ministers of Finance and ECA, was a private sector component. That private sector component did not have to go through a debt service suspension initiative. And that is where, with the finance ministers, the envoys, we're working on a special purpose vehicle, which is creating a new and innovative financial instrument that will allow for Africa to be able to honor its private sector debt services. $16 billion we're talking about, which is quite substantial, but without asking for a moratorium on commercial and private sector debt. So essentially, there are 3 elements of the debt service suspension initiative. The first element, the low-income countries. The IMF has already given somewhere over $300 million to about 17 countries as debt suspension. On the public sector side, with the DSSI and the G20, we can get about $13 billion. It does not affect your credit rating. It does not affect your access to markets. On the private sector side, if you do, but there is no private sector debt service initiative yet out there in the markets because the private sector doesn't want it. And I think, as Dr. Kaberuka said very clearly, African countries do not want to not comply with their obligations to the market. All African countries will honor and respect their obligations to markets. What African countries are doing today, and ministers of finance, is to say, how can we respect our obligations to our sovereign bonds, to our commercial markets, but at the same time continue to provide ourselves with some liquidity? Hence the conversations around, Brady bonds, the ECA and PIMCO. We're working together on something around sort of a repo markets that we can put together that will crash rates. Today, Africans are going back to the markets at something like 500 basis points. We could get 250 basis points. In March, it was 1,000 basis points. It has now come down substantially, but I think we can still make some inches in that process and go down even further. And I think that is the third conversation in this thing. So I think if I want to let you with one response, is there is no ambiguity. Any country that is eligible for the debt service suspension initiative should take it, because the countries need it to be able to access their medical kits, to be able to access PPEs, to be able to ensure that safety nets are done in the right way. It is $13.5 billion, and Africa needs that liquidity today.
Thank you, Vera. But
Khalidou, can I come in as well?
Yes, I would like to give an opportunity to Albert to make a statement, and then give Akin the opportunity to rebut and answer before, if he's still with us. So I will have other questions for Albert. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Khalidou. And just adding to what Vera said, the issue of rating agencies is one that we need to actually discuss a little bit more. And why is because my sense is we are living in a little bit of a schizophrenia here. One, we're saying that this is the deepest crisis of all, since World War I. For Africa is going to be the worst in 25 years. Yet, when we are assessing the adequacy of the macro framework, we are assessing countries like there is no crisis. And I'm seeing in some of those assessments, a requirement for fiscal consolidation right now, which makes clearly no sense to me. How is it possible that in a world where even the IMF is advocating for countries to let the deficit slide as part of the fiscal space that is needed to respond to this crisis, how is it that we are actually, some agencies, some economists are requiring that countries actually keep a balanced budget or not exceed the 3% deficit that they had actually committed to before the crisis, just like nothing has happened? So my sense is we need to bring that discussion also in the context of the depth of the current crisis. This is unprecedented, and the way we assess macro framework adequacy needs to take into account not only how serious this crisis is, but also how we need to invest currently, how we need to actually start implementing the kind of policies that would allow countries to recover. The worst mistake we can do at this point is to get into that risk, that contractionary set of policies that led Africa in the 80s to actually waste a whole decade. This is not the time. And I think we need to also get into that discussion with rating agencies, with all the institutions getting to assess macro framework adequacy in and around Africa, that we actually take into account those points. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, I have a follow-up question for you, Albert. My understanding is that the World Bank itself is somewhat reluctant to look into the debt in terms of rescheduling, moratorium, on the account of, I don't know, the PCS or other. Could you just elaborate briefly? Because I understand that multilateral financial institutions have some difficulties accepting any form of debt moratorium.
No, that's not correct, Khalidou. I'm not sure where you get the information from, because just like the UNECA, IMF, and World Bank, and actually for the DSSI, World Bank and IMF work together to ensure that African countries access that debt standstill. We are working, with bilaterals. We are working with.
I'm talking about the World Bank. I'm talking about your own portfolio.
Yes, of course. That's what we are working with African countries to ensure that we create that space by moving a lot of our funding into fast track to make sure we have that fiscal space right now. We are expanding our portfolio, again, as I mentioned, in areas such as social protection. We are investing, just to give you a couple of numbers, we have approved more than $482 million just in the past 2-3 months in fast track for 27 countries in Africa. So we are actually getting into that space, and quite aggressively. So on that,
I do understand that you have provided additional resources, but I'm specifically asking you whether the World Bank has contemplated the issue of a moratorium with its own debt, or whether on the account of certain number of principles that I'm familiar with, it's called preferred credit status, that it is uncomfortable at considering its own debt moratorium. Is that a fact, or is it not true?
Khalidou, this crisis is extremely severe, and countries need to explore all options. And the bank is also working with its members to find ways to avail those resources that would allow us to come in for additional resources. And this, in addition to all the budget support that we are providing countries.
All right, thank you. Akin, I understand you have other commitment. I think you've heard from Vera and then Albert. Before I go back to Mr. Kaberuka, and do you wanna respond to those clarification they made?
No. I mean, I didn't see a great deal of divergence between what I said and what Dr. Songwe said, for instance. I think we're broadly on the same lines. Access to market, it was a concern as this crisis evolved. This has been something that's been going on for 2 or 3 months. At the outset, it was a concern. We had conversations with many of the multilaterals proposing potential solutions, and it came up as an issue. And the DSSI, yes, we said exactly the same thing about that. 2 of the 3 rating agencies have said they won't downgrade anybody on account of accessing it. And the third has said they put you on review, which is still fairly open given what's going on under the circumstances. And that countries that don't have access to markets certainly should draw down. I think the private sector piece is going to prove a bit thornier to resolve, and I hope it does get resolved, because I forget his name, the panelist from the World Bank's point, fiscal consolidation is going to be challenging at a time like this, obviously. It goes against the grain. And it speaks to, again, some of the inequalities I talked about earlier. in the developed markets, nobody's talking about fiscal consolidation as a means of responding to this crisis. So it would be perverse if you expected countries in sub-Saharan Africa to be doing that at a time like this. But how to square that need and that reality with the private sector side will be tough, and we certainly will try and play our part to see what we can do to make it work. But yeah, a lot of innovativeness and unique solutions will be called for in that scenario. But fundamentally, it has been challenging, but Africa has progressed. We have access to markets, we've moved to middle income. It wasn't just simply putting out a begging bowl like it was before. The needs were more nuanced this time. And it's been a process of evolution to respond to them adequately. And that process is ongoing right now. And that's basically all I wanted to say. Thank you. Okay, I couldn't hear you at all. I can't hear you.
Yes, I'm sorry. I thank you again, Akin, and I would like to go back to Dr. Kaberuka. As a special envoy, obviously you have been talking to both the multilateral, the bilateral, as well as the private sector. What has been the reception? What have you been experienced, and are they willing to discuss some of these issues that we've been discussing in terms of debt moratorium? What's your take on so far, your experience, your expectation? Were you able to think that you're going to come to some kind of a successful conclusion?
Thank you. First of all, let me say that I'm amazed at how much time we're spending on debt moratorium. I actually think this is a pie in the sky. I think we need to be focusing on probably something different. And that something different is how to minimize the damage to our socio-economic fabric at the moment. And that will require a whole set of instruments, of which debt service moratorium is very, very small part. I think what would affect Africa's credit worthiness in the future is not participation or not in the moratorium. It is our inability to recover from this once in a century global crisis. If Africa went into another recession which lasts 10, 15 years, that is credit worthiness gone. It's not about participating in a net present value neutral moratorium, which by the way is voluntary. So I hope that in a business conversation like this, we probably need to focus more on what does the international community have to do with Africa together to return this continent to 1 billion people to economic growth? What can we do to minimize the damage? What will it take to rebuild household, consumer, business confidence so that the continent can return to growth? I fear that in these conversations, we're spending too much time on this issue because it is very emotive, it is very value-laden. But frankly, it's voluntary, it's net present very neutral. And as Vera was just mentioning, the markets are actually sanguine about it. So I'm hoping that maybe at some conversation today, you can go back to basics. How many people here know that, for example, Albania or Montenegro, which is quoted as B+, like Kenya, because in Senegal, and Rwanda, pays 3.6% on 7-year debt? There are issues we need to analyze there. And that we can come to at some other point. But I hope that we can discuss what it will take to return our businesses back to growth, to rebuild consumer confidence, to make sure that instead of focusing maybe in the future on headline GDP growth, we figure out what it will take to provide income support, business support, so that they can begin to recreate wealth. I hope that that could be the conversation. I'm not wanting to take over your chair. I'm just advising that perhaps the debt moratorium is taking too much of your time, when it's actually the smallest part of what should be this conversation. Now, as for what is the state of conversation between the envoys and the international community and the African leadership, by the way, because there are things we have to do ourselves in Africa. I can just give you an example. There are many countries in Africa today who are deploying huge subsidies, all right? Petroleum subsidies to consumers. With the prices coming down now, might this be the time actually to go away from these blanket subsidies into converting some of those subsidies into income support, income transfer to deserving households? There's a whole range of tools we can be discussing. How can we get maybe our central banks to use some regulatory forbearance so that banks can begin lending to SMEs? So we're having those conversations internally, internationally as well. I said I saluted the IMF at the beginning because just to give you a number to show you the leadership which Kristalina has showed. If I'm not wrong, in the past years, IMF would deploy about $3 billion for Sub-Saharan Africa per year, $3 billion. In the last 4 months alone, they have deployed $17 billion. And we've been having this conversation in a very useful way. I think we are focusing now on special drawing rights. It is a tough conversation for reasons which one can understand. But with the help of our leadership, including President Kagame, who is here, who has been extremely helpful in this regard, we're trying to see if we can get movement, at least on the existing special drawing rights, and then some redistribution of those same rights, because we think that is where some of the new money will come from, rather than just rearranging existing resources. So it's a going concern. We are continuing our task, and I'm hoping that with everyone's support, we can succeed. But Khalid, I hope that you get off the debt moratorium, because this moratorium is absolutely a very small part of what's up to do.
Thank you, Dr. Kaberuka. I recall, Vera, you participated in a number of, talk and seminars and webinars almost a year ago, before even anybody heard about this COVID-19. So there is seriously an issue of debt in Africa, because since it was subject matter for a lot of discussion. But before I ask you, I would like to bring in again Admesus. Even though, I mean, you are a regional financial institution, you've been dealing with African debt, and you've explained earlier what is it TDB is doing. What's your take on the debate, not only on the debt, but what do you think African countries should be doing going forward in terms of addressing these issues, whether it's economic development or better governance or policies?
Well, Khalido, I think I'm going to take the cue from Kaberuka's comment that I think the structural damage of the economies is what we really have to avoid, because I think this is a temporary crisis, as we know, even if it goes for several more months. So I think from our perspective, what we've tried to do is try to keep the financing operations going on in the areas of not just trade, but also, providing financing for projects, SME lending, and the like. And I think what we've seen is there's a huge risk of having long-term damage to the great momentum that Africa had built up over the past decade. So I think for FIs like us, who are focused on the real economy with both the private sector, but also supporting the public sector with ensuring security of supply of critical inputs to sectors such as agriculture, I think that continuity is very, very important. And I think that's the resilience that we've been focusing on, is to make sure that you don't have unintended damage being caused purely by freezing. And I think what Albert mentioned around the behavior of ratings agencies, I think that is also something that needs some serious policy review, because this is where you can end up creating a vortex, an unnecessary downward vortex, where you have contractionary tendencies coming in. We've continued to push on the various infrastructure projects, industrial projects, and we've managed to form new partnerships as well with institutions like the World Bank, actually, that has come to the party in a way that we didn't expect. We should be announcing a huge facility with the World Bank soon, and I think this is credit to the World Bank stepping into the sub-regional space and providing much needed long-term funding for the real economies to continue benefiting.
Thank you. Vera, as I mentioned earlier, you have been an advocate and you have been speaking on FARA about the debt in Africa more than, if not a year ago, but I've listened to some intervention you made. So this is, even though at the time there was no COVID-19. So what is it, what's new? And most importantly, how do you see going forward? Why is it each time there is an event, Africa is always the continent that is asking for some kind of assistance and help? When you look at the press, a number of young Africans are wondering what is the money has been used for and why we are always asking more money, forgiveness, moratorium. What is wrong with our leaders or our government? Why have not been able to put in place some kind of systems or governance so that we can actually manage our own affairs? And if you don't mind, there's this idea maybe Africa should come up with some kind of a major plan, call it Marshall Plan or African Plan. What do you think? Do you think it is grandiose ideas but has no teeth? I just like your comments.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. There's many questions, but very good ones. Let me just start maybe with three things, and then I'll come back to your questions. I think the first thing, which is a number that I think all of us know and we haven't mentioned it, but let me just mention it for the sake of it. The developed world, and the G20 in particular, has availed itself of somewhere in the order of $10 trillion of sort of printing of money to respond to this crisis. When you look at the United States, for example, they started as a sort of, how do we respond to the crisis? Maybe $800 billion stimulus, then 2.2 trillion, then another 2.2, and maybe we're going to go to a third one. So the need for immediate liquidity is not an Africa-specific issue. It is a global issue. We all need liquidity, and we need it yesterday. Now, when you're the United States and you have a central bank that can print money, you print it. When you're Africa and you don't have a central bank that can print money, you say, where can I get immediate liquidity? And that's the debt service suspension initiative. That's our way of providing an immediate stimulus. So it is important. 40 million people on the employment line in the United States, 20 million people on the employment line at least identified in Africa. We needed immediately to come to the aid of those citizens. So I think that's where the liquidity conversation happens, is where do you get that immediate injection of capital to ensure that those that you want to protect, because you need to build back better later, as Damaso is saying, do not crumble. Our SMEs, 70% of Africa's economy is small and medium enterprises that essentially are on short-term lending policies. If the banks do not have the liquidity that they need, then immediately the SMEs don't have it and they close down. As we all know, it's much more difficult to open a business than to keep a business open. So what we need to do is make sure that those 70% of our SMEs that are today already alive, stay alive. We need to make sure that our airline industry, we have seen in France and in Germany and in the United States, $500 billion to shore up the airlines in the United States, $11-12 billion to shore up Air France. Who is shoring up Kenya Airways and South African and Senegal Airlines and Cote d'Ivoire? We need the liquidity. Hence the reason for some immediate injection, just to stabilize what we have. Ethiopian Airlines, of course, has been doing well because they've been able to repurpose. So I think when we talk about the need for immediate liquidity and the need for some debt service suspension, that's what we're talking about. It is really also about shoring up the future. The second thing I think is on the conversation on debt, and we've always said that, is that debt in itself is not a bad thing. Everybody needs debt to grow. Actually, the more debt you can afford, the better it is, because the faster you will grow. And I even posit to say that some of the reasons why some of those countries that Professor Kaberuka was talking about are growing so fast is precisely because they were able to combine concessional lending from the World Bank with market lending to be able to put in place. If you take a country like Senegal, it went from 23% access to energy to 70% access to energy. That allows it to grow. Kenya, the same thing, 30% access to energy to 80%, or access to water in the case of Kenya, for example. We needed to make those huge infrastructure investments. that were needed to begin to shore up the future. Now, the question which you have asked and which is important is, what have we done with all the debt? Have we been able to reinvest it in assets that have a rate of return that is higher than the cost of the debt? And that's the question I think that Professor Kaberuka also raised, is our borrowing rates are particularly higher than the average borrowing rates of an equivalent country. So Cote d'Ivoire borrows at almost 3-4 times the borrowing cost of Chile. Why is that? And that is the perception of risk on the African continent. And the question then is, can we begin to revise and review this risk perception? Can we begin to look at what is it that creates the impression that Africa's risk is higher than others? When we do work, we see that Africa has never defaulted on an energy project, and I'm sure Admaso can tell you that, or even the IFC can tell you that. But Africa continues to have this negative risk perception, and that's because of the governance issues, the transparency in the use of our resources. And I think that one of the things the African presidents have come out with very clearly at the very beginning of this crisis was to say that they are willing to be very transparent on the use of all the resources that are going to come onto the continent because of COVID. And hopefully we can build strong institutions as we grow back later. But the other thing that we need to look at when we talk about debt, most of the time we talk about external debt. We don't talk about what we call conveniently arrears to our own private sector. There's a huge chunk of Africa's private sector, Africa's SMEs, that never get paid up for the services that they provide to state-owned enterprises or to our governments. And that's a huge and big part of the African economic fabric. We need to worry about those arrears. We need to ensure that our own private sector is also taken care of, because a lot of the debt is to pay the external services, but we do have an internal process that needs to also be checked into. And finally, we always go back to the same complaints. Domestic resource mobilization. Can we do more? I started my intervention with 13% tax to GDP. We need to go to 30%. How can we bring that up? And then, of course, illicit financial flows, our resources that leave the continent. Can we build institutions that ensure that we don't get that kind of leakage through the process? Because as long as we continue to have leakages in our sort of in systems, we will continue to suffer, I think, the crisis.
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe before we wrap it up, I would like Albert to make some few remarks before I give Dr. Kaberuka the opportunity to give us his perspective on going forward. What is it exactly we think African countries should be doing? Albert?
Yes, thank you so much, Khalidou. I think what Admasu said earlier on World Bank getting into the sub-regional space is one very important development. That's part of the $482 million that I mentioned earlier that we have, availed for countries during this crisis. And most of it is actually going towards helping firms, helping the private sector, and also helping consumers in the informal sector so that we don't experience a sudden, stop in our economies. So this is extremely important as we think beyond managing the emergency and focusing a little bit more on the recovery and the post-COVID world, because this is not the end of the world. Second, I would like to echo Dr. Kaberuka's point. That is going to be just a little part of the solution. But let's be clear, no country in the world, given the magnitude of this crisis, can pretend to handle it all by itself or without actually getting some form of debt or some form of fiscal stimulus or some form of deficit that would allow them to face this really unprecedented crisis. Third thing is, what is it that we should actually be investing in as we speak? One quite important element is, if people were still thinking that the digital is a luxury for Africa, COVID has actually established the fact that we need to be ramping up our investment to close the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure gap across the continent and get the right regulatory framework for the digital to actually drive our economies, not only as an enabler, but also as a source of job, as digital entrepreneurship can be a source of job creation for countries like Kenya, for example, where you already have that tradition of private sector. The private sector is what would drive recovery, and we need to make sure we do not stifle it during this, using a policy response that is not appropriate. Second, quite important point is the regional dimension. This is probably the time for African countries to deepen the regional value chains. We have seen how suddenly we may not be able to import whatever we need. But if we can actually deepen those relationships across African countries and leveraging the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, as President Kagame has said earlier, we can certainly build more resilience in our economies. Third, more important is how do we make sure we lower our dependence to commodities? One of the biggest shocks to African countries is actually coming through the commodity shock. Commodity prices, especially oil exporting countries, commodity prices have collapsed in a couple of months by more than 60%. Oil has gone to 70% decline before picking up a little bit more. So how do we really think through diversifying our economic base, adding value to our products before we export it to neighbors? And why don't we take this opportunity to build the kind of regional value chains that are needed to create those jobs Africa needs? Africa is in need of more than 20 million jobs per year. Can we actually, just count on, borrowing for that? I don't think that's going to be the only solution. And let me close on one final word. The word governance is disappearing more and more from our development conversation. I think it's time to bring back the C word in those discussions: corruption and transparency. We need to really take this opportunity to really look quite closely into our public expenditure. What have we been spending on? You asked the question, Khalidou, and it's a valid one. What have we done with the oil boom? And when you look at it, a number of investment that we actually embark on were not properly selected, were not efficiently implemented. So the efficiency of public investment is one area where we can actually avail some resources to expand that fiscal space we need. So let's really bring back those discussions to the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert. That's excellent. Dr. Kaberuka, do you want to say some closing remark, and then we'll take maybe a couple of questions from the audience?
Thank you, Khalidou. I just have three thoughts. Number one is that we don't know where this COVID is going. No one can tell at this point when it will end or how it will end. So there is a lot of risk and uncertainty in this. And always, when you're faced with risk and uncertainty, the most logical thing to do is to build scenarios. So we need to think together about the kind of scenarios of how we return the continent to growth. I've said before, Khalid will be remembering this, the 1980s, 1990s were known as the lost decades. Our countries worked very hard on economic reforms. And at the turn of the millennium, economies in sub-Saharan Africa, many of them, for the first time, had returned to economic growth faster than population increase. Now this crisis has put all this to an end. So we have now to think about how best to minimize the damage. Not just minimizing the damage, but how to create resilience in the system. The one very much unknown factor is how the global community, apart from pulling out their $10 trillion, how the multilateral system will respond. We don't know. We don't know. Because typically, what we saw in the global financial crisis, whether the G20 came together, provided all kinds of solutions, and then 2 years down the road, they were back to discussing domestic policy preoccupations, including fiscal consolidation. This global solidarity was gone. So we have to make some assumptions about how the international community will respond to this global problem. Now, because we don't know, This I want to emphasize what the president was saying at the beginning, that this CFTA thing has to be given impetus. Impetus because that will be our response to the uncertainty in the global community. We don't know what will happen in terms of global supply chains. Will nationalism return with many countries want to manufacture their own stuff? Probably. We don't know a lot about uncertainty there. And therefore, because there is so much uncertainty in what will happen when it happens, we need to quickly figure out how to work together inside the continent to build that resilience which we need in this period of uncertainty. And this is why I really welcome the action by African leaders vis-à-vis the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in Addis Ababa. It has done an amazing piece of work in such a short period of time. It's an example for me of what we can do for ourselves. This platform, which has been created under the leadership of STRIVE, means that every country now can go on that platform and access testing kits, reagents, protective equipment, at the prices probably which might even be 40% less than what prevails now on the market. So there are many things we can do together. So that is, I think, my first conclusion. Second is on these public health systems. So we dealt with Ebola with a lot of international cooperation. Now, have we learned the lessons in terms of how to strengthen our public health systems? I don't know. But I think this is the time to sit back and take another look. Whether we should be investing so much money in expensive tertiary services of the type Europe was building in the 70s or 80s, or we should actually take a closer look at how to build resilient public health systems, right? At unit cost, which may be lower than it is. So you can see that even countries like the US are challenged. Their global health systems are challenged. And therefore, we need to prepare for the next virus. The next, we don't know what it will be. We don't know how bad it will be. So I think on the resilience, because of the uncertainty on multilateralism, on what we can do ourselves, on what we can do for the global health, public health systems, and finally, I mean, the lack of Albert, we probably have other views. I think as we look at how to return our continent to growth, I think headline growth numbers will probably be less important. I think what will be important is what is happening at the level of households and at the level of firms. It will be extremely important to give this word inclusion a new meaning. Let me just give an example which I had 2 days ago. I don't know which country it was, where this firm employs 200 people, and then 5 of them had COVID, so they infected everyone else, so the company was closed, all right? So workers have gone home, they have no incomes, the firm has no revenue stream. So, and multiply this several times across countries, and you can imagine what is happening to firms and households. And therefore, as we reshape economic policy, this will be extremely important. And I hope that we can all work together with our governments on how to integrate much more strongly social policy into economic policies instead of emphasizing headline growth, which is still important, of course, much more than we have done in the past.
Thank you, President. And I think we're going to wrap up this session. One of the questions that was posed, actually, you adequately responded in terms of what is it the Africa need to do in terms of strengthening its resilience on the health sector. There was an aspect of it which is about food security, but I don't think we necessarily need to dwell on further. But what I retain from this session is that Africa is not in a bad situation as one would portray. The economies are still fairly strong. I mean, there are disparities. Certain number of mechanisms that have been put in place in large part because of the work you have been doing, and Vera has explained the coordination you have taken. And clearly there are mechanisms in place in terms of DSS, but most importantly, that Africa continues to suffer from a certain number of prejudices in terms of our ability to borrow at the cost that is reasonable based on the rating we have. This is one thing that I've noted. And then most importantly, as Albert also mentioned, is that despite all what has been said and the resources that have been made available, the population still sometimes question the use of the resources, whether the resources are being used at the good end, and whether some level of corruption has not diverted some of these resources. Unfortunately, these are some of the issues, including financial illicit flight from Africa. What I retain globally is that I remember 3 months ago there was a sense that Africa will actually collapse, that you will see uprising, social unrest. Fortunately, it didn't happen. And then I think most of the African countries have shown a great deal of resilience, but there's some problem, and I think we discussed about them. And I think this conversation needs to continue because we are not at the end of it. I guess we will make a final determination at the end of the year what has happened. But clearly, thank you very much, Flory. I would like to give you back the floor, but I would like, all of us to thank our panelists, Vera, who's made a fantastic contribution. Albert, even Akin has to leave us, but I think we got a good perspective private sector. My friend Admesus, I think it is great to hear what at your level institution has been doing. And Mr. Kaberuka, I think we all appreciated that your role, which is extremely important at the African level. Again, thank you. Flory, back to you.
Thank you, Khalidou, and esteemed panelists for this incredible discussion on the first day of our Leaders Forum. Let me just say that with people like yourselves who are leaders of your institutions and corporations, to share a robust conversation and dialogue about this important issue. We just thank you very much for bringing that a dialogue to the table and for taking on the issues that CCA would like to focus on, and to say that with your kind of leadership, we're confident that Africa will have a resilient rebound from COVID-19, and that we'll see good things coming forward. With that, let me now turn to Dr. Jeffrey Sturchio. Dr. Sturchio is the president and CEO of Raven Martin, and most importantly for me, he is the chairman of the board of CCA. Jeff, we welcome you to make closing remarks.
Thanks very much, Flory. Well, this has been a very interesting and thought-provoking panel today, and I wanted to start by thanking, on behalf of CCA and our board, I want to thank His Excellency Paul Kagame, the President of the Republic of Rwanda, for his opening remarks, and also to my Vice Chair, Diane Wilkins, for moderating the fireside chat with President Kagame. And I'd also like to thank our panel for such an excellent discussion on the global financial and African response to needs of the COVID-19 crisis. Now, I just want to take a minute to focus on three of the most important messages I'm taking away from this discussion. The first, as President Kagame said, is that cooperation is essential. This is a global crisis. It requires global solutions. We're all in this together, and a coordinated response to both the economic and financial, the health crisis and the social crises that are coming about as a result of COVID-19 are going to be important. The second point I wanted to make is, as Donald Kaberuka summarized quite nicely in the panel, we need to have not just commitments, but actions. We need to respond flexibly. We need to make sure that the response provides additionality, and also that it's inclusive across the continent. And the third point is that as we're dealing with today's crisis and trying to address the many issues that our panelists spoke about, we also have to think about shoring up the future, as Vera Songwe said. And I think there we'll continue to look for new solutions and new partnerships, And I was really impressed with the examples that our panelists gave us of the kind of resilience that we're seeing in the response that will help prepare Africa for the next crisis to come, but also answer the important question that, that Donald Kaberuka posed. What is it going to take to return Africa to growth? So I know that we'll have a chance to delve into these issues further in the other sessions of the Leaders Forum. I'd like to encourage you all to join us for tomorrow's discussion on resiliency in action, economic and health innovations in response to COVID-19, which will start at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The lineup includes His Excellency Felipe Nyusi, the President of the Republic of Mozambique, the Honorable Betty Maina, the Cabinet Secretary for Ministry of Industry, Trade and Cooperatives of Kenya, and business leaders from GE Africa, M Pharma, Covington and Burling, and others. Finally, I want to again thank our sponsors for their generous support for the CCA Leaders Forum. And I'd like to thank all of you, the audience, for joining us today. Look forward to seeing and interacting with you over the next couple of days and at future CCA forums, both virtual and live, when we can come back to meeting in person again. And I'd like to encourage you all to stay safe and healthy. Enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks again to everybody for a really terrific kickoff to the Leaders Forum. Thank you very much.